Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling presidential power,
Ooh.
and specifically how a conservative president might try to take on that beast we call the federal bureaucracy.
Oh, that's a fun one.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're working with excerpts today from Mandate for Leadership,
Yes.
which lays out a whole roadmap for how to do this.
It really does.
And they don't mince words.
No.
This chapter really focuses on using the executive office of the president.
The EOP.
Yes, the EOP as the ultimate tool to get things done.
Like the command center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So set the stage for us.
Sure.
What's the problem they're trying to solve here?
Well, the federal bureaucracy is massive.
Yeah.
Huge. It's sprawling, and it often has a life of its own.
Yeah.
It pursues its own agendas.
They use a pretty loaded word here.
Oh, they do?
They talk about the woke faction.
Yes.
So what do they mean by that?
What they're arguing is that a large portion of the civil service.
So these are the career government employees, the ones who aren't appointed.
Right.
The stay through administration.
Exactly. They're kind of the institutional memory.
Okay.
But what the authors are saying is that a lot of these folks are ideologically opposed to a conservative agenda. So you can imagine if you're a conservative president coming in, you're trying to implement your policies,
Right.
and you've got this massive workforce that's maybe not so enthusiastic about your ideas.
So you're constantly facing pushback, you're facing delays,
Absolutely.
maybe even attempts to undermine things from within.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you even begin to tackle that?
Well, that's where the EOP comes in.
Okay.
The book argues that a powerful EOP is essential,
For a conservative president.
especially for a conservative
To
president.
really get control of the bureaucracy.
Right.
Okay, so the EOP is like their weapon, their secret weapon.
It's their command center. It's how they centralize control and really start to rein in that bureaucracy.
Okay, I like it.
And ultimately, it's about redirecting power back to the American people, they say.
Okay, so color me intrigued.
Right.
But how does this actually work?
Sure.
In the real world, what parts of the EOP are we talking about, and what kind of power are we really talking about here?
So they break it down into a few key components.
Okay.
First, and arguably the most important, is the Office of Management and Budget.
OMB.
OMB, that's right.
So that's the one that's
They handle the budget.
right. But can they really control what goes on in all those other agencies day to day?
Well, more than you might think.
Really?
The chapter describes them as the president's air traffic control for policy.
Ooh, I like that.
It's catchy, right?
Yeah.
And that's not just about money.
Okay.
They have a say in regulations. They even influence management across the entire government.
So give me a for instance, like,
Sure.
how could they really put the brakes on something?
Well, let's say there's a program an agency wants to fund
Okay.
that this hypothetical conservative president really doesn't like.
Like maybe it's some sort of diversity initiative they see as too woke.
Exactly.
Obviously.
OMB can use this thing called apportionments.
Apportions?
Apportionments.
Yeah, I've never heard of it.
It's wonky but powerful.
Okay.
They can basically say, nope, that money is frozen.
Hmm.
You want more money. You got to reallocate what you've got to something that fits with the president's agenda.
Oh, so it's leverage.
It's leverage.
OMB gets to say how agencies spend their money to make sure it all lines up with what the president wants.
Precisely. And they even advocate for this one OMB approach.
One OMB, what does that mean?
It means the entire agency is on the same page, presenting a unified front, always representing the president's vision.
So no internal disagreements,
Yes.
everyone's singing from the same hymnal.
Exactly.
Okay, makes sense in this context, I guess.
Right.
So what else is on this EOP power tour?
Well, another big player is the National Security Council, or NSC.
Yeah, that's the big one for foreign policy and defense.
Absolutely.
What kind of shakeup are they talking about there?
It's all about alignment.
Oh.
They envision an NSC staffed with experts who completely share the president's worldview.
So you're weeding out anyone who doesn't agree with the president.
Essentially, yes. They even suggest eliminating entire directorates that don't align with the agenda.
Wow, eliminating entire directorates. That's pretty drastic, isn't it?
It is.
But like, what are we talking about here? Give me an example.
Well, let's say there's a directorate focused on climate change.
Okay.
And this hypothetical president doesn't see that as a priority.
They could just get rid of it.
They could scrap it entirely and create a new directorate focused on something they do care about.
Like energy independence or something?
Precisely reshaping the NSC to reflect the president's priorities with everyone marching to the same beat.
Okay, I'm definitely sensing a theme here. Lots of rowing in the same direction, so to speak.
It's all about control.
Okay,
Yeah.
so OMB, NSC. What other parts of the EOP are key players in this strategy?
Well, on the domestic policy side, you've got the National Economic Council, the NEC.
Right? The NEC, they're all about the economy.
Exactly. Taxes, trade, all those big ticket items.
But how much influence can they really have? I mean, what about institutions like the Federal Reserve?
Right.
They're supposed to be independent.
They are.
Can the NEC tell them what to do?
That's a great question, and they acknowledge those limitations,
Okay.
that they argue the NEC still has some powerful tools at its disposal.
Like what?
Well, first, appointments.
Okay.
They would play a key role in recommending people for positions within those financial regulatory agencies.
So making sure they align with the president's economic agenda.
Exactly, stacking the deck with friendly faces.
Okay. But what about the agencies that are truly independent? Can the NEC tell them what to do?
Not directly.
No. Okay.
But they can shape the conversation, they can develop policy recommendations, and even publicly advocate for certain positions.
So it's like using the bully pulpit to nudge those supposedly independent actors in the right direction.
Exactly. It's persuasion as much as direct control.
Okay, so the NEC is like the president's economic brain trust.
That's a good way to put it. They'd work closely with other White House entities like the Council of Economic Advisors.
Right, the CEA.
To develop and implement that overall economic strategy.
Yeah, the CEA, they're the number crunchers.
That's right.
But I'm also seeing potential for conflict here.
Oh, yeah.
What happens if different parts of the White House have different ideas about economic policy?
It's a valid concern, and the chapter actually mentions past tensions between the NEC and other entities like the Domestic Policy Council.
Ah, the classic Washington turf wars.
Exactly.
How do they propose avoiding that?
Clear lines of authority.
Okay.
They emphasize establishing clear jurisdictions from the outset so everyone knows who's responsible for what and there's no stepping on toes.
Okay, that sounds great in theory,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in the real world, I imagine it can get messy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered OMB,
Mm-hmm.
NSC,
Yes.
and the NEC.
Right.
What other EOP offices are crucial for this conservative power play?
Well, they touch on several others, though, in less detail. For example, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR.
The USTR.
They're responsible for shaping global trade in a way that benefits American workers and businesses. Or at least that's the goal.
So the USTR, they're the ones negotiating trade deals.
That's right.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty important role these days.
Absolutely. And they argue that the USTR needs to be much more assertive in defending American interests.
Especially against China.
Especially against China. Yes, and less talk about free trade, more about protecting American jobs.
So fewer multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization.
Right.
And more bilateral agreements where the U.S. can kind of set the terms.
Exactly. They also talk about focusing trade relationships on democratic nations that share our values.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So trade becomes a tool not just for economic growth,
Mm-hmm.
but for promoting a certain ideology.
It's part of a broader shift in thinking among conservatives.
Okay.
Trade isn't just about economics anymore. It's about geopolitics and ideology.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
What are some of the big recurring themes you're seeing in this chapter?
Well, one big one is this reliance on political appointees over career staff.
Okay.
They really want people in key positions who are absolutely loyal to the president's agenda, not to the agency itself.
So a lot of loyalty tests, perhaps?
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
They also repeatedly emphasize the need to aggressively use executive power to overcome resistance from the bureaucracy.
So no shying away from conflict.
No.
Using every tool in the presidential toolbox.
Exactly.
Wow.
And finally, there's this really interesting tension between consolidating power in the White House
Okay.
and using that power to ultimately shrink the size and scope of government overall.
That's fascinating.
It is, isn't it?
It's like using executive power to limit executive power.
Exactly. A bit of a paradox, but very much at the heart of conservative thought.
Okay, so we've got a powerful EOP, a president with a clear mandate,
Right.
and a bureaucracy they see as the enemy.
Yeah.
What else does this chapter suggest? Stay tuned to find out.
All right, so let's dig into a few more specific examples here. The chapter highlights the Council of Economic Advisors,
The CEA.
the CEA, yes, as another key player in this scenario.
Okay, so remind me what the CEA does again.
They're the ones crunching the numbers, providing the economic analysis.
Right, the number crunchers.
Exactly.
So what role do they envision for them?
Well, they want the CEA to be the president's in-house economic think tank,
Okay.
but not just academics theorizing. You know, they want them to offer practical advice on how to achieve specific policy goals.
Okay, so less about abstract ideas and more about how do we actually get this done?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they point to the CEA's annual economic report of the president.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's this big document laying out the administration's economic vision, and they want to use it strategically.
To, like, rally public support.
Yes.
Build momentum for their policies.
Exactly.
Okay.
But they also raise a more specific point about hiring practices for senior economists at the CEA.
Okay, this sounds interesting.
So traditionally, these economists haven't gone through the same vetting process as other political appointees.
So they might not be as ideologically aligned with the president?
That's the concern.
That could create problems.
It could. And the chapter suggests that a conservative president should ensure everyone at the CEA, even the number crunchers, are fully on board with the agenda.
So no holdovers from the previous administration who might be skeptical of the new direction.
Right. Everyone rowing in the same direction.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the National Space Council,
The NSPC.
the NSPC?
Yes.
What kind of changes are they envisioning there?
Well, they emphasize maintaining continuity in space policy, building on initiatives from the previous administration.
So things like the Space Force,
Yes.
the Artemis Lunar Program, support for the commercial space sector, all those big-ticket items.
Exactly. But they also identify some challenges that need attention.
Like what?
Well, for example, they talk about the growing problem of orbital debris. Ah, yes. All that junk floating around up there.
Exactly. Threatening satellites and even astronauts.
Yeah, that's a serious issue.
It is. And they also want to see more focus on developing space situational awareness capabilities.
So being able to track all those objects in space, predict potential collisions, that sort of thing.
Precisely. And to foster innovation, they want to streamline regulations for the commercial space sector.
Yep.
Make it easier for companies to launch satellites and conduct other space activities.
So they see a thriving commercial space industry as vital for both the economy and national security.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OSTP?
The science advisors.
Yes, the science advisors.
Oh.
I have a feeling this is going to be interesting.
It is. They see a lot of what they call leftist ideology embedded in scientific research,
Okay.
particularly in areas like climate change and gender studies.
And they want a conservative president to actively root that out.
Absolutely. They also want to shift focus away from climate change research.
And towards other areas like artificial intelligence and biotechnology.
So less about the climate, more about boosting the economy and national security.
Exactly. A pretty significant reshaping of research priorities.
Oh, it is.
What else do they suggest?
Well, they want to reform the U.S. Global Change Research Program,
Okay.
which they view as biased on climate change.
Okay.
They call for more scrutiny of government-funded research overall, making sure it's objective and not driven by political agendas.
So a more skeptical approach to science, at least in certain areas.
You could say that.
Okay, anything else?
Yes. They also take issue with the social cost of carbon metric used in policymaking.
Okay. Remind me what that is again.
So it's this attempt to put a dollar amount on the damage caused by carbon emissions.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that.
And they argue that it's flawed, and it's used to justify excessive regulations.
So they want to see it scrapped entirely.
Yes. Along with a major overhaul of the permitting system for infrastructure projects. Ah, yes, the permitting process. Everyone knows how slow and complicated that is.
Exactly. It's often blamed for delaying important projects, and they want to streamline it.
To make it easier to build roads, bridges, pipelines.
All of that. Cut through the red tape and boost economic growth.
Okay, so far we've talked about trade, economic policy, space science and technology, even infrastructure permitting.
It's a lot.
It's a pretty sweeping vision for how a conservative president could reshape the government, isn't it?
It really is. And it all comes back to this underlying belief that the federal government has become too large and too intrusive.
And they see a conservative president as the one to rein it in.
Exactly. The mandate for leadership, as they call it.
Right. But they also touch on a few other EOP offices,
They do.
though in less detail.
Yes.
For example, there's the Council on Environmental Quality,
The CEQ.
the CEQ, right, which is responsible for implementing the National Environmental Policy Act.
Oh, NEPA.
YEPA, right? That's the law requiring environmental impact statements for major projects.
You got it. And the chapter calls for a significant rollback of NEPA regulations.
To make it easier to build things without getting bogged down in environmental reviews.
Exactly. From their perspective, NEPA has become a tool for environmental activists to delay or block important projects.
And they want to change that.
They do. along with those infrastructure permitting reforms we talked about earlier.
Right, right. Streamlining the process,
Yeah.
making it faster and more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay. So a pretty clear deregulatory agenda there. What about the Office of National Drug Control Policy?
They pinpoint the fentanyl crisis as the top drug policy priority.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge issue right now.
A devastating issue for sure.
So many overdose deaths.
Absolutely. And they advocate for a multi-pronged approach. Preventing drug use, providing treatment, reducing the supply of illicit drugs.
Okay, so like trying to disrupt the flow of drugs across the border, cracking down on trafficking organizations.
Well, all that. But they also want to see more funding for treatment programs.
Okay, so a balanced approach, addressing both the supply and the demand side of the problem.
That's the idea.
Okay, what about the Gender Policy Council?
The GPC.
The GPC. Now, this is the one that was created by President Biden, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right.
To promote gender equality and LGBTQ plus rights.
That's correct.
Okay, and what do they say about that?
Well, they call for its immediate abolition.
Really?
They see it as a vehicle for what they call radical gender ideology.
Okay.
And they want to see all of that gone.
Wow. So that's a pretty strong stance.
Yeah.
And what do they envision replacing it with?
They propose creating a new office focused on promoting life and family.
Okay, so a pretty significant shift in that area.
Yeah.
What about the Office of the Vice President?
Ah, the VP. They highlight the unique leverage that the vice president has as an elected official who isn't directly answerable to the president.
Right. They can't be fired.
Exactly. It gives them a different kind of authority.
Okay.
And they argue that a conservative president should utilize the vice president to their full potential, give them a significant role in policymaking and implementation. They see the VP as a key ally in this battle against the bureaucracy.
So a much more empowered vice president than we've seen in recent administrations.
It's a different approach, for sure.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of detail here about the EOP and this potential conservative power play.
We have.
But I think it's time to connect all of this back to you, the listener.
Absolutely.
Why should you care about these obscure offices and these inside-the-beltway power struggles? It's easy to think of these offices, as just bureaucratic machinery, right?
Yeah.
But as we've seen, they have a huge impact on policy, on everything.
Yeah.
From trade to scientific research.
Absolutely.
To even how we define family.
Yeah, it's really about the nuts and bolts of how our government works.
Exactly. And this chapter,
Yeah.
It paints a very specific picture
It does.
of how a conservative president could use all of this to push their agenda. Now, whether you agree with that agenda or not, I think it's important to understand how it could play out.
Right. It's about being informed,
Yes.
regardless of where you stand politically. Exactly.
Well, we're talking about potential shifts in environmental regulations.
Yeah.
Different approaches to gender and LGBTQ plus issues. Even the balance between federal power and individual liberty.
Absolutely.
These are big picture things that affect all of us.
They do.
And I think this idea of a president facing a potentially hostile bureaucracy,
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
It is.
How do they navigate that? How do they get things done?
Yeah. How do you actually govern in that environment?
This chapter suggests a very assertive approach,
It does.
but it raises questions about,
Mm-hmm.
the balance of power in our government.
Right.
If a president were to fully embrace this roadmap, what impact would that have on our democracy?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Would it lead to a more efficient government, like the authors argue? Or could it undermine,
Yeah.
the norms and institutions that we rely on?
That's a question worth pondering.
It is. It reminds us that elections have consequences. And the decisions made in the Oval Office, they really can ripple out across the entire country.
They do. They affect all of us.
So I think this chapter gives us a lot to think about.
It does.
The power of the EOP, the strategies a conservative president might employ,
Yeah.
and the potential implications for all of us.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of staying informed and engaged.
Yes,
The people who occupy these offices wield tremendous power.
they do.
And understanding their potential impact is crucial for anyone who cares about the future of our country.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper,
Yeah.
and never underestimate the power of ideas to shape the world around us.
Well said.
That's what this deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us in Hawkable.